Welcome to Frankly Speaking, the podcast on responsible business from Frank Bold, the European public interest law firm. I'm Richard Howitt, and after many years leading debates on responsible business in the European Parliament, I lead our discussions about the very latest developments in corporate sustainability, sustainable finance, business and human rights. Today, putting the meaning into meaningful engagement. The OECD guidelines, United Nations guiding principles, European regulations on reporting, due diligence, deforestation and forced labour all require companies to undertake meaningful engagement with their stakeholders. But what does this mean, and how does it operate in practice? Our old friends at the Ethical Trading Initiative have looked at this in detail, working most recently with their partners in the food industry. And I'm delighted that Danny Miles, their head of collective action, joins us on Frankly Speaking to discuss this. Welcome, Danny.
Yeah, welcome, Richard. Thanks very much. Thanks for having us today. Very pleased to be here.
And we're also joined by Dr Wilson Odiyo, Corporate Affairs Director for Eastern Produce Regional Services based in Kenya, which provides technical support, marketing and logistics to their group's agricultural producers in Eastern and Southern Africa, principally responsible for producing tea, avocados and macadamia nuts. EPRS is a member company of the Ethical Trading Initiative and will talk to us from their frontline experience of how to achieve meaningful engagement. Welcome to you, Wilson.
Many thanks, Richard. I'm very glad to be here.
Now, first, Danny, if you're going to engage, make it sure it's meaningful. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? But can you define for us what you say is meaningful engagement and the principles which underline it?
Yeah, look, absolutely, Richard. I think you're right. Businesses have been engaging with stakeholders for decades, I think, and then the language has been codified now by legislation. It's put it more into focus, but it's ultimately been extremely important, and particularly, I think, in the agri-food sector, the food supply chains are complex, long, fragmented. This leads to a reliance, as we all know, on informal migrant labour, lots of intersecting risks around gender, precarity of work, safety. And I think what a lot of this leads to is this level of opacity, is a lack of visibility at the top of the supply chains from the brands and retailers involved in this, which makes engagement really important. And this meaningful engagement, ultimately, what we're talking about is engagement that meets the stakeholders on their own terms, that takes into account the issues that are most important to them, and is genuine two-way good faith dialogue. This the criticality, and ultimately leads to action. And it's critical that this engagement, to be meaningful, takes place before decisions are made that impact those rights holders, workers and communities. But look, I think that many businesses find this difficult, don't know where to start. It's hard to identify stakeholders, how to prioritize, how to engage. So there's clearly a demand. We certainly thought ETI for some more practical guidance on how they could help.
And the five principles that you say underlie this are legitimacy, accessibility, safety, equitability, and respect. Just comment a little bit about how you select those.
Well, actually, I mean, interestingly, that's from a separate piece of work that was undertaken in the apparel and textiles sector, which formed the foundation now of the work that we've done in where we are with food and farming. But look, that's critical. I think that level of inclusivity, legitimacy, it's really important that you build trust in this space. And I think those principles that you've described there are all part of how we do this level of transparency, how we make this process inclusive and diverse, how you make sure that the feedback and the comments of those stakeholders are genuinely heard and respected is critical to it. And I think having a framework like that, I think the laser framework, as they like to call it, is really helpful for business when they are engaging and considering that.
Laser, I've not heard that one before, but it's a good way of remembering it.
Yes, well, interestingly, the first time they did it, I think they just defined those principles in no order whatsoever, and someone realised actually that there's quite a handy acronym there we could use.
And I think respect jumps out to me more than any of them. These fundamental emotional connections in any relationship of trust that you've mentioned and respect, I think are absolutely fundamental to this. First question to you, Wilson. I do want you to describe in detail about how you've engaged stakeholders. But before we do that, you as a company chose to undertake a human rights approach to doing business. You then contacted the Ethical Trading Initiative, became a foundation member, and then you've engaged fully and become a member and in this particular piece of work. So you've gone on a journey yourselves as a company. And I wonder, why did you as a company decide that human rights was important to you and the thing you wanted to do?
If you had asked me that same question, 6-7 years ago, my answer would totally have been different. We were at a point where we had, at least on paper, we had what we thought was a good enough, what we call a grievance procedure. We were always cognizant of the fact that from time to time, people would be perhaps unhappy about this. Perhaps it will be our employees unhappy about, something about their wages, something about the tasks that they had to accomplish or something. We were engaged somewhat with our community as well. Of course, being agricultural, then we've got a large community surrounding us. But this sort of, grievance procedure that was there from a policy perspective wasn't working very well because we weren't receiving any reports and this sort of thing. And if you had asked me at the time, I would have said, well, we are not receiving any reports because we are doing very well. Unfortunately, we were bombarded with, accusations of human rights, abuses and, areas to do with our security personnel, some aspects of GBVH, and so on and so forth. And so we decided that there are these accusations that are coming. We do not think that they are right. We do not think that they're justified. So we decided, let's go a little into this and find out, and we thought all along that we were going to find that there was nothing. So this is how we started to get into doing a meaningful stakeholder engagement to see what were the salient human rights issues that were there within our companies and also outside of our companies looking in. Now, with that perspective and then developing that into a human rights impact assessment that revealed to us the salient issues that were there. Now, our eyes began to sort of see that there were possibilities of things happening around us that we were not necessarily aware of, significantly, among other reasons, because there was suspicion that we would either not deal with them or there would be retaliation if people raised issues. Now, with that, and of course that led us to many other things which I can talk about a little later, about setting up of operational grievance mechanisms and that sort of thing. But with that sort of background, we realized that there was much to be gained by not looking inwards, but by opening up ourselves and joining an organization like ETI, where we would be able to meet with other, organizations that are like-minded, other members of ETI, other corporates, other NGOs. We would be able to, through participating in ETI, be able not just to be able to compare notes with the rest of the people and see what they're going through, but also be able to bring our perspectives and get learning, most importantly, because we realize that even as we put in place all these procedures and all these processes, that we still did not have all the answers. And therefore, it was important that we sat with peers, we sat with people with different perspectives to be able to gain from them. And so therefore, that journey is a journey that we believe can only lead us to a place where we can improve more and more as we continue along that line.
And none of us have got all the answers, of course, but I think for you as a company to be bold enough to say that, many companies, I think, do go along exactly the same journey, but not all of them will say it publicly. So I congratulate you for that. So let's now get to meaningful engagement with stakeholders. I think after this process started, you started off in Kenya, working in detail on this. How do you engage with stakeholders, and what happens? How is it done in a way that makes it, in your view, meaningful?
I think the first thing we did, and which you have to do, is to do a stakeholder mapping. I mean, who has an interest in our business? Who has any sort of leverage also on our business? And for us, when we looked at that, there had been, all this time we had been conducting, what are called production and social audits, the likes of Rainforest Alliance, Global Gap, and the rest. And therefore, there were certain findings from that perspective, but those were just part of the stakeholders. We've got community, for us, very big. Our employees, the trade unions, the contractors that we deal with, our buyers, our suppliers. And so this stakeholder mapping exercise, which is what we started with, identified for us who our stakeholders are, and some of which I've just mentioned. And the process was to then engage with these stakeholders in a two-way sort of perspective, going on to present to them that we have our business here. Our business has got impacts on you as stakeholders. What are those impacts? What are we doing right? What do you think we're not doing right? What would you like to see? And that meaningful engagement with feedback from them became very important to us. Initially, the stakeholder engagement that we carried out was more inward operationally within our operations. Then we moved to our supply chain. And something unique about our operations is that our supply chain, and especially if you talk about tier one suppliers, significant part of that is made up of smallholder growers that supply tea into us. So those were also part of the stakeholders that we consulted on in a two-way communication basis. And that revealed what the salient human rights issues were, both within our operations and outside our operations when you talk about the supply chain. Now, some of those issues that we identified were issues around gender-based violence and harassment, issues around, working conditions, issues around wages, issues around environmental issues about the impact of our businesses on the environment. And that led us to having an action plan because we needed then to do two things. One, mitigate those salient issues. And that we were able to do through having an action plan that identified clearly what the issues were, what needed to be done, of course, with the input of the stakeholders, assigning responsibility, assigning timelines. But the next line then led us to developing operational grievance mechanisms.
Can I just pick up the point with Danny? Some of those concerns, workers will always want better wages, of course. Industrial processes will always have waste that needs managing and potential pollution. But when Wilson talked about sexual violence and harassment, we know that it's also a plague worldwide, and none of our countries is free from that. But that's a very challenging issue, I think, for many companies to respond to. How do you advise your member companies on that gender issue? And did you learn something from the work that you've done in relation to that?
Yeah, absolutely, Richard. I mean, we've learned a huge amount over the last, I'd say, 3-4 years at ETI, specifically in food sectors. We got very involved following there was a BBC, I think, expose around issues, particularly in the Kenya tea sector about 3-4 years ago. And ETI convened our members at that time in action to understand those risks and assess them. I mean, these are clearly systemic, established challenges that were happening in that sector, but as you mentioned, more globally in agricultural supply chains. And I think that engagement piece underpins that. That's the advice, that we bring our members together, we convene, we collectively do that work. And this led ultimately to us following an initial site-based issue to think of a broader approach. Clearly, what's the methods that have been undertaken in the past haven't been successful. This issue continues to grow and get worse in many cases. And we established something called the Gaia program at ETI, which is Gender Action in Agriculture. It's basically our approach that underpins how we approach gender-based violence and harassment. And that is underpinned by meaningful stakeholder engagement specifically. Wilson was involved in the first phase of this, which we brought together over 90 stakeholders from business, trade unions, academia, NGOs, government, and there's a real value in that working together that can lead to a much greater level of, I think, of openness and that safe but challenging space that ETI can create to do that work. And much of the work is undertaken in person, on site, in the countries of origin, and it's extremely sensitive, as you can imagine, Richard, the working on these topics on sites with people who you're effectively asking to try and share information about some of the worst things that could possibly happen to them. And safeguarding of the victims and potential victims in that process is prioritized throughout. We build a strong local structure with civil society organizations, local experts to ensure that that's all built into the project. And look, that's been successful, we think, in creating this level of principles. So again, a framework for how organizations can address gender issues when they find them in their supply chains, and they will if they look for them. If you're using genuine gender responsive human rights due diligence, the issues are there. And the principles themselves, I think the next phase we're trying to enter now is that practical implementation. So it's very good to have theoretical principles developed with the right people, but the next step to find a supply chain, to get the level of trust within business and local communities to try this, build the tools, build the resources and the methods that we can then apply at scale. Because what we don't want is for these principles to be cascaded into supply chains without that level of support. It's really important that you take a much more holistic systems-based approach, that we can involve the workers and the broader community and government and the other stakeholders in this process to help it be delivered. And I think that what we've seen from members and businesses like Wilson and EPRS involved is that they really benefit from that kind of more that holistic approach where you're bringing in multiple stakeholders in the delivery, but also in the support of it as well.
And Wilson, picking up on what Danny said there about supply chain, and you've already referred to, you've talked about tier one, but let's just look beyond that. In agriculture, there are many smallholder farmers and people working in very small companies that are quite remote, probably from your group, remote in geographical distance, but not in terms of the relationship. But it is clearly difficult for companies who don't have an established direct relationship with a stakeholder to be able to do that, and there will be other people around that maybe are trying to put obstacles in your way. So how have you been able to overcome that in terms of the supply chain in particular?
I think the answer lies in, again, at the risk of talking about meaningful stakeholder engagement too many times, but the answer lies there because if people have got to see value, you almost have to sell to them what this is all about. People have got to see value in what this is all about. And when people get to see value in what this is about, they come on board. You get buy-in. And that buy-in doesn't come by, for instance, saying, oh, we've got a green leaf agreement between us and smallholder farmers and sticking into that agreement, saying that we want responsible business conduct, and this is what responsible business conduct entails. So this training, mapping your stakeholders, training is critical. In our case, I'll give you an example. In one of our companies where we have 14,000 smallholder farmers supplying tea into our factories, we put in the system whereby we have green leaf sheds where we collect the green leaf from, and we've got chairpersons of those sheds. So each shed has a committee, and we've got chairpersons of those sheds. Now, those chairpersons, together with their committees, have gone through GBVH in particular training with us, as well as broader human rights training with us. And through that, we've been able to get buy-in. And then apart from the buy-in, then you must get a place where you direct them when there are any issues. And that's where the OGMs come in.
OGMs being?
The operational grievance mechanisms.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on that because you mentioned it right at the beginning. Many critics of companies on human rights say that the grievance mechanisms that are there and that any actual remedy doesn't happen in practice and isn't good enough. So what have you managed to do in setting up your new grievance mechanism to try and overcome that?
Now, what we realized from the outset is that there are grievances at two levels. At the first level, you've got grievances that are more operational in nature. There will be issues around things that your employees or people directly associated with you will be raising issues about, and it will be issues around whether, their wages have been paid, whether they have been paid properly, and so on and so forth, issues around safety and health at the workplace. So those are tier one. I'll take an example of one of our companies, Kekuzi, where we've got a grievance mechanism called Sikika. Sikika is Swahili for be heard, talk to us, be heard, we'll hear you. And Sikika is divided into two. So there is a tier one, which, as I've already explained, is the operational one. And then there is a tier two, which is the independent mechanism headed by an independent senior lawyer, not within the company, but based outside the company, where issues of serious human rights nature then are reported. And that could be even from within the company, but mostly from outside the company. And because of the disconnect between the company and the tier two mechanism, and continuous awareness and a thorough investigation mechanism that is participatory, which the complainants can participate in, we get, of course, a degree of buy-in. This is not to say everyone is going to be confident about the mechanism, but we get a very high degree of buy-in, including, of course, feedback. There's also an appeal mechanism where if you are dissatisfied, you can appeal to yet another independent senior lawyer. And through that, we've been able to build a certain level of confidence in the grievance mechanism. Of course, from time to time, there are all sorts of remedies that the tier two mechanism has been able to give to those who are complaining.
Give us one example of a remedy.
Let me tie this remedy issue to a specific challenge. About one of the challenges is that people always expect a financial remedy. We have given financial remedies, so that needs to go on record. But some issues might be a proper medical examination, if it is something of a health and safety nature, a proper medical examination, medical treatment, psychosocial support. These are the sort of remedies that we have been able to give. But also in certain instances, we've been able to give collective remedies. Maybe it is about a road that needs to pass in a certain place so that people can get better access. And I'm talking about the community perspectives. And those are remedies that we've been able to afford the complainants.
Really good examples. Danny, equitability is one of your principles. And on this podcast, we've often discussed the big problem in all of this of power imbalance, that in the end, the big purchasing companies always can end the contract or can get a workers' act. And even if they are operating in good faith, there's a fear of that. How on earth do we try to alter the power imbalance so that there can be confidence and trust on both sides?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and it's not going away. This has existed for some time, as you say. If I'm honest, I think that we probably haven't seen enough of this level of engagement that we expect, and that the legislation is trying to drive forward, which is a critical part of how these imbalances are addressed. I think if you once you start to engage meaningfully, then there's much greater levels of transparency and accountability of your actions as an organization. I mean, having worked in a large food business in the past, I completely understand the fear, and there's often a disconnect between how you're operationalizing a human rights program and then how commercially an organization operates. But I think the closer those two departments get is really critical in those large organizations. And I do think that, look, I mean, from an ETI perspective, we'd always try to really encourage our members to seek out suppliers, businesses, sites where there's a functioning trade union. I think that the industrial relations process has got a huge part to play in this and brings that level, well, it starts to level the playing field from a power imbalance, give those individual workers more of a collective voice and protects that in law. So I think a key target for ETI and for our global businesses is to really improve that level of freedom of association and supply chains over the next 4 to 5 years. I mean, build the foundations for that. And I think that that's going to really underpin meaningful stakeholder engagement. It'll obviously, I think, also help it to get traction on both sides. But yeah, look, ultimately, where you've got this disconnect throughout the supply chain. And I think that the remoteness is often a problem, Richard, where the businesses making decisions don't really understand what's happening further down, and they tend to cascade these demands rather than sharing that responsibility. So I think if we can encourage that, if MSE, if the requirements built into legislation are going to develop it, then I think that goes some way towards addressing the issue. But I mean, for the best will in the world, we're probably not going to get there in the next few years, but I think that the direction of travel is promising for us.
And Danny, as you're aware, in Europe, the European Commission has just completed its consultation on new guidance about how the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, is to be undertaken by business, and how companies engage is obviously an important part of that. What did you say to the Commission, and what would you like to see in the guidance?
This has been a big piece of work at ETI, as you mentioned, quite short notice, quite short window for such an important topic. And look, we're making a submission to that consultation on behalf of our tripartite memberships. I think, as you know, ETI's trade unions, NGOs and companies, I think really key that we reflect those perspectives in there. And as you'd expect, I mean, look, meaningful stakeholder engagement is referenced many times in our submission in the way this is structured. It's very much around, we think, increasing accountability, increasing transparency. For us, this is about the potential, once you've enshrined UNGPs into enforceable legislation, to really make this much more worker-centred and encourage businesses to shift away from that sort of top-down audit compliance-based approach. And there's a really good opportunity to do that now. Look, the legislation won't come into force until 2029. There's going to have to be, I think, at some point in future, the opportunity for more detailed guidance around how you should engage with stakeholders and how you do this. So whilst we have put this in there now in terms of how we want businesses to engage, I think that there'll be a point where there's much clearer guidance, and there'll be probably 2-3 years for the work that we're doing now to become embedded, to become more accepted, tested and refined. And we hope that we can strongly advocate to the Commission for more detailed guidance based on the work that we've been doing in consultation with our partners.
Yeah, so the way Europe works, it'll be some time probably before they revise it. So as far as possible, they've got to get it right now. I don't expect you, Wilson, to have a detailed knowledge of European decision-making processes, but you are a Global South business working with Global South businesses. So when you look from Kenya, where you're joining us from, to those sorts of European legislative requirements for good due diligence, for meaningful engagement, what are you thinking? What would you say back to Europe from your experience?
Yeah, thank you very much. Of course, yeah, I hear about all the legislation that is in progress in Europe and area issues around due diligence and that sort of thing. I think the important thing for me and for us from this side of the world is context. Just to give you an example, there have been instances in which, for example, we've looked at employment, for example, among our supply chain, and principally among our smallholder growers. You're talking about concepts like living wage, for instance, or regular employment, for instance. And something very interesting that we found when we were doing our supply chain due diligence is that, you talk about the power imbalance between the employer and the employee, and principally in this case, those who are plucking tea. And we actually found that unlike what would have been an assumption that we had at the beginning, that there was a likelihood of the rights of these employees being trampled on by their employers who are more powerful. That on the contrary, the way labor has been organized among the smallholder farmers is that it is actually the worker that is more powerful than the farmer. They dictate which farm they go to and when. And so you've got to adjust, the farmer has to adjust, who is essentially the employer, has to adjust everything around the whims of the employee. And therefore, I'm just using this to just bolster my point about context. The contextual differences at times are so significantly, important that if they were not taken into consideration, then we would end up by certain expectations that then would not be practically met by the global south. And I'm talking about Eastern Africa in this particular case.
We're moving towards the end of the podcast, so I've got a final question for both of you. Again, Wilson, first. I don't want to have you on to not talk about how food production, food systems, agribusiness is changing in the face of climate change. There's a lot of discussion about regenerative agriculture, circular economy approaches to food waste, dietary shifts towards many more meat substitutes, and much else besides. And I wonder, representing Global South business in agriculture, are you part of those discussions? Are you thinking about those challenges? Are you ready for the perhaps very big transformation we're going to see in the not too distant future in food and food production? Or is this something very distant from what you're able to be concerned with?
No, we are actually living it. So it's not remote from our thinking at all. I mean, taking care of the soils, you mentioned regenerative agriculture, making sure that, you talk about circular economy, treatment of waste, and generally taking care of the environment. We've seen climate change in more respects than one. As agriculturalists, we see it in terms of rainfall patterns. We see it in terms of pests and diseases that are emerging, that were hitherto not known in our part of the world, but that are emerging now. In recent years, in our avocado production, we have had to deal with scales that we did not see, and all these are tied to climate change. So we are very intimately involved with initiatives around sustainability in food production, so taking care of the soils, taking care of water. If you have the time for it, I'll just give you a very quick example about what we are doing in one of our companies where we are very irrigation heavy. What we've done is that we have made water pans that we are using to sort of have rainwater directed into these pans. And therefore we are not using local rivers or local water catchment areas that would bring conflict, because obviously the water is mostly all drying up. And so because of that, we are getting very self-sustaining from an irrigation point of view. And if you think about that and many other respects, we are obviously looking at our carbon emissions, tracking that and seeing in areas in which we can improve. Fortunately for us, a good number of our crops are tree crops. And so from a carbon perspective, obviously, we are also contributing positively. So this is something that is constantly on the table.
That's a great challenge back to all of us in the global north who sometimes think that in emerging markets and in developing countries the transition is behind and impeded. There are, of course, lots of challenges, but that was a great answer to how EPRS is leading these discussions there. Last question to you, Danny. Danny, you're head of collective action for ETI, which is a very good job title. But ETI has just published its strategy up to 2030, and one of your 4 strategic pillars is collective action for systemic change. I hear so often we need to change the system, can't do it one by one. How do you think we make system change?
Again, big question. Look, I think that what I found from my time at ETI is that so much of this we can't do alone, right? The whole basis of collective action at ETI is to how we do this with the right individuals, how we bring the voices of civil society and trade unions into the room with business in that safe but challenging space, as I described then. But that's critical to it. You drive change through understanding and by trust building and relationships. So this is not going to be delivered by a detailed report or a human rights risk assessment. It's developed by individuals who have a shared, I think, a shared intention, a shared desire to drive improvement in their supply chains. What I've seen at ETI is that genuine power, it's difficult, right? It's really difficult to bring these people together, often with conflicting views. But we've seen real genuine change from involving the right set of stakeholders at the right time and making sure that the work that he's done is worker-centered. I think, again, when I was previous life in the corporates, the way to drive change was to really make those issues personal. So human rights in supply chains can seem like quite an opaque and distant problem for boards, but bringing them really into contact with the individuals and the rights holders for whom this is really impacting is absolutely critical. And that's where I've seen the change. But look, it will continue to underpin our work. I think it's the only way to do it. You genuinely cannot address issues of the scale we face. And as you mentioned there, through the shifting food systems, the volatility that's going to bring over the next 20 years, the challenges for business around mass migration on climate-based instability is going to be huge. And again, that requirement to bring it right back to the start of the conversation around engaging with stakeholders to understand how they're being impacted is going to be critical. And it will form the basis not just of EU legislation, but of broad legislation around the world, hopefully, over the next 10 to 15 years. So it's really key now that business is building that understanding of how to do this and starting to integrate it into their practices.
In this podcast, we've heard how meaningful engagement with stakeholders is first and foremost about building trust, and that the engagement leads to action, which gives people confidence to engage with it. We heard from EPRS that they were subject to accusations, but instead of closing in on the company, they opened out and looked to where the problems were and were willing to engage in order to be able to do so. And that included dealing with gender-based violence and harassment, really serious issues where safeguarding of victims is an important part of how the company and other companies can act. We heard that about a independent grievance mechanism outside of the company called in Swahili Be Heard. And we heard from Danny that more engagement will be needed because of the new legislation coming, and that ultimately it will lead to more accountability. He said, don't cascade down responsibility, take responsibility yourself. And Wilson said, never forget the local context. Judgments can't be made from ivory towers. Sadly, we have come to the end of our podcast, and I'd like to thank very much Danny Miles of the Ethical Trading Initiative and Dr Wilson Odiyo from EPRS for joining us today. Thank you both.
Thanks, Richard.
Many thanks, Richard. And thank you.
You've been listening to Frankly Speaking, the Frank Bold podcast on responsible business. Find out more about Frank Bold's Responsible Companies section on our website, and please give us your feedback on our LinkedIn page or by commenting via your podcast provider, where we hope you will share the conversation and give this podcast a 5-star rating. And remember, you can watch us on our YouTube channel now too. Thank you again to Wilson, to Danny, And to all of you for listening, do join us next time, and goodbye.